For those of you who don't know us, I'm Catherine Van Houten, and this is my husband, Peter Van Houten. It's our joy to be sharing Sunday service with you this morning. We'd especially like to welcome those of you who are guests and visitors, perhaps from other points in the county, or those of you who have been with us for the weekend for programs, or those who are just arriving for the coming week's program on our intensive in Raja Yoga. It's a joy to have you with us. I'd like to begin by reading from Rays of the One Light. These are commentaries on parallel passages from the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. This week's topic is, who are true Christians? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ said in chapter 10 of the Gospel of St. John, "All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." Many Christians, not surprisingly, quote this saying in condemnation of other spiritual teachers, not only the Old Testament prophets, but also Buddha, Krishna, and others who lived before Jesus, as well as, by inference, any who came after him. Yet Jesus himself said in St. Matthew chapter 5, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Nowhere do we find Jesus condemning or even gently criticizing other spiritual masters. His criticisms were reserved for worldly attitudes and for those hypocritical Pharisees who had allowed religion to become for them a pretense. Paramahansa Yogananda explained that the expression, "all who ever came before me," referred to those spiritual teachers who placed their egos and their self-importance ahead of the Christ consciousness, in the sense of drawing people's devotion to themselves and not offering it where alone it truly belongs, to God. Yogananda himself was very firm in this regard. For example, he never spoke of anyone as his disciple. Instead, he always insisted they are God's disciples. God is the guru, not I. Ego is a way station on the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The soul is first trapped in lower bodily forms. Slowly it evolves to the human level, at which point self-consciousness appears. Only in human form can self-consciousness transcend material form altogether, including the lower identity of ego consciousness, and discover the true divine self within. Self-consciousness manifested as ego is an incentive to deliberate self-development. Later in this process of development, however, the ego becomes an obstruction. Inevitably, new spiritual aspirants do not emerge effortlessly from the vortex of ego consciousness. Desire must be offered up resolutely and ever more wholeheartedly on the altar of infinity. It is a gradual process, and few, even among those who seek to help others, are free of ego. If, however, their motive in teaching is not to serve, but to be served, they deserve a severe reprimand, as Jesus gave them. For their direction of development is no longer upward, but downward. In the name of giving up desires, they are creating new ones. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter, desire obscures even the wisdom of the wise. Their relentless foe it is, a flame never quenched. Intellect, mind, and senses, these combined are referred to as the seat of desire. Desire, through them, deludes and eclipses the discrimination of the embodied soul. O Arjuna, discipline your senses, and having done so, work to destroy desire, annihilator of wisdom and of self-realization. Give God the credit for everything you do. See Him as the true doer. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
This is from Yogananda's book of mystical poems, Whispers from Eternity. Open my inner eye, O fountain of light, that I may behold thee in the dance of the myriad-hued atoms. Burst upon the doors of space, that I may see thee behind the swirling mists of material illusion. Behind thy walls of brilliant cosmic rays, thou art hiding. Open every portal in nature, that I may see thee hiding everywhere. Who are the true Christians? I remember when I was a child, it often struck me that there could be so many dozens of different Christian organizations, all considering themselves followers of Jesus of Nazareth. And it seemed that so many of them were absolutely convinced that only they had the Christian teachings correct, that only they understood what Jesus really wanted his religion to look like. I remember one of my favorite jokes when I was growing up had to do with a person who has, at a ripe old age, died and gone to heaven. And he awakes in heaven, and a brilliant, Christ-like being and creature who's just radiant and beyond belief is showing him around heaven. And it is awesome and thrilling, everything that he sees. And everyone there is just blissful and joyful. And at one point they come to like a mountain face, and hewn into it is a cave with a doorway that is sealed with a little teeny peephole that can be slid back and forth. And the angel motions to him to come over, and he slides back the little keyhole, and you look inside, and there's a group of people in this very austere, somber setting, very quietly and somberly kneeling in front of an altar. And he looks over at the fellow who has just come to heaven, and he says, "What do you see?" And he says, "Well, there's just this tiny group of people in there." And he nods very sagely, and he says, "Those are the Sandemanians." And the young man says, "Well, why are they off in this little room?" And he closes the peephole, and he bursts out laughing, and he says, "They think they're the only ones here." Turns out the Sandemanians actually were a small religious group in the earlier part of the 19th century. I don't even think they exist anymore as an active religious work, but there were a number of famous scientists who were actually included themselves as Sandemanians, and they had this thought that only they really understood Christ's teachings, that only they were the true Christians. I remember once, many years ago, I'd only been on the spiritual path for a fairly short period of time. This was, I think, in about 1977. I was nearing the end of my medical training, and as one of my elective exercises, I was spending 3 months at an Indian Health Service hospital in a very remote area of Arizona called Tuba City. And it was a very wonderful experience for a young physician because you got to sort of see everything. You got to see a whole different culture. And one of the very nice things about it is because there was nothing else to do there, you got to know the entire staff in this little medical community well because you worked together all day, and in the evenings there was no television, there was nothing to do, and so it was very social, very collegial. And I remember I got to know one of the senior nurses in the ICU very well, very nice woman. And she was a Christian, and at that point I was sort of my inner life was really becoming awakened, and I was just so happy to see another devotee. And I was telling her a little bit about what I was doing, thinking that she could relate to, here's another lover of God, here's another seeker. And I swear she made it her mission that she was going to show me why I was doing everything wrong, and that really what I needed to do was be a Christian the way she was, with this very kind of very focused, narrow approach to Christianity. And I always just appreciated the fact that she was nice and sweet and kind and concerned about me. And there was a part of me that just thought it was hysterically funny that she was trying to convince me with her arguments because they were so patently ridiculous in my mind. And I remember once she had stopped over at my house. You know, it was a common thing for us in the evening. We'd go visit other people or have dinner together. And one evening she had stopped by my house, and I was sitting in this little living room area reading Autobiography of a Yogi, which was sort of my Bible at that point. And I'd probably already read it 10 times in as many months. And she said, well, what are you reading? And I said, oh, I'm reading this book, Autobiography of a Yogi. It's about Paramahansa Yogananda. He's my spiritual teacher. And I'm trying to understand how to be better myself by reading about his life and his experiences with great saints and lovers of God. And she said, can I borrow it? And I said, sure, yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you think. Well, about a week later, I finally went over to see how she was doing with it because I did want my book back. And she came to the door and she had this wild-eyed look on her face. And I said, well, what's the matter? And she said, the maid. And I said, well, what? And she said, well, I had your book and I was going through it page by page and making notes on what was wrong with it. And I had a piece of paper almost every page full of all the things that were wrong with this book and how you were going to go to hell if you did this. And the maid came yesterday and she took all the pieces of paper out and she threw them away. And I don't have time to do it all again. And it was very sweet. I, of course, thanked her for being so concerned about me and took my book back. And the thought went through my mind is, her karma just ran over her dogma. So often in the religious life, people think that somehow being a true Christian is joining just the right church, the ones that really have Christian beliefs down to perfection. And in fact, when you look at it, it ends up looking more like a social club or a bowling league and more concerned with the minutia of specific dogma, rather than being concerned with self-transformation. In fact, what I would say quite clearly is, who is more Christian? Someone who is a proclaimed atheist but spends their life really trying to improve themselves, be a kinder person, be a wiser person, serve others, be less selfish, being more selfless, or someone who goes to Mass every week and says grace before each meal but is totally unscrupulous. There's some people that would say the person who goes to Mass and is a terrible person is really the true Christian. where I think what we would say is it's the person who's trying to become more Christ-like. It's very interesting to me, the word Christ and Krishna have the same root. So we could actually say being more Christ-like or being more Krishna-like is actually the same thing. And in fact, what we're looking for is not to be more like just Jesus, the physical man. We're looking to become more the manifestation of the Christ consciousness, which is what infused Krishna, what infused Christ, and gave them this billion watts of spiritual power to transform humanity. And were such key players in the whole flow of history because they came with God's grace and God's power. And that power is open to us all. You know, I had this thought this last week that if you think about something as simple as just your arm, that your arm, even though it looks nice and solid, you can feel it, you can't see through it, that in fact, if you go down to subtler levels, that it's made up of atoms. And atoms themselves are mostly space. There's very little actually what you could even consider matter or mass making up the atoms of your arm. And if you go even subtler, start looking with even a finer and finer cosmic microscope, you see that in fact those atoms are made up of smaller particles, things called quarks and other kinds of bosons, that themselves are made up, we know now, of energy. And that energy at its deepest level is made up of God's consciousness. In fact, you think about our arm, and yes, it's a physical arm, but it's actually God's body. This is God's thought. And in fact, if we could see it with God's eyes, or the eyes of a great saint or master, this is a snapping, hissing, crackling aurora of energy, incomprehensibly beautiful, incomprehensibly awesome. We just can't see it. But and yet that's its true reality. Well, if that's the case, if this is God's body, if this is God's arm, how can this arm do something that's evil? Because we see in mankind that human beings are capable of horrible atrocities. You know, just in the last few weeks, I'd watched several documentaries that were about history during World War II. It's an area I have interest in. And the first one was on the Nuremberg war trials. And actually, I was, for those of you who are familiar, this was actually the first time in history that the people who, at the end of a war, were brought to a court-like setting and tried for crimes. In the past, it was just they were the losers and they were the losers. And this time, if they had actually done things that were wrong, they were brought to this setting here in Nuremberg, and they were tried just like criminals, and it was done as an actual court case. First time in history this had been done. And the documentary I was watching was almost all done by this famous director named John Ford. He's done a lot of westerns that are very famous, and the Army actually hired him to come and do this documentary. So it's this 3-hour-long footage of key points in this trial at Nuremberg. The reason I bring this up is that at the very end of the trial, they let all the defendants, the 20 or so chief Nazis that were on trial, who'd committed all these horrible atrocities that had been brought out in tremendous detail in the trial, and they gave them all their day in court. They all got a chance to stand up in front of the whole court and say exactly what they thought and what they felt. And the thing that was so remarkable to me is here they'd watched all this horror of what they had created, and how few of them showed the slightest bit of contrition or compunction about what had happened. Many of them said, we were right, we just lost, but we were right. We were trying to change the world. We actually had this idea that if we could eliminate the inferior portions of society, that we would change the world. And I thought, how is it possible in a world that has been created by a benevolent God that such things can happen? Later in the week, I watched a documentary on the defeat or the destruction of Nanking back during, just before World War II in the late 1930s. The actual, the capital of China was not Beijing then, it was Nanking. And the Japanese had just taken over Shanghai, and they were marching toward Nanking. And everybody who could flee the capital had already done so. There were a handful of Americans and other foreigners that stayed to help the poor who could not afford to flee. And the Chinese army that was retreating from Shanghai into Nanking. And the Japanese finally got there, and the Chinese army was literally out of ammunition, out of bullets, and just had to surrender. And literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers surrendered. The thing that was remarkable is the Japanese took so many prisoners, it was many times their force, that they sort of couldn't figure out what else to do, so they just killed all the prisoners. I mean, just wiped out 200,000 enemy soldiers because they couldn't afford to feed them. They didn't have enough soldiers to take care of them. And somehow in their thinking, they thought this was a reasonable thing to do in the situation. And after the war, again, the people who were responsible for this, when war crime trials came forward, they thought they had done the right thing and showed no compunction for it, and yet it was a horrible, horrible atrocity that occurred. How with a benevolent God are such things possible? Well, the truth is, it all comes down to the fact that the way we are designed, yes, this is God's body. Yes, this is God's energy. Every atom of our being is filled with God's consciousness. In fact, it is God's consciousness. God's done a very interesting thing in our creation. He's basically imbued us with a specific thing called ego. And he's given us free will. So he's given us a sense of individuality, and he's given us the option to do what we will with this body. Basically, Dad's thrown the car keys to us and said, have fun, go do what you want, learn some lessons, and someday you'll come home. But you're going to have to learn this on your own. But I will always be here waiting for you to come back. I'll always love you, I'll always care about you, but you will have lessons to learn. And I've given you this vehicle and this ego, and I've given you free will to let you do what you wish. Here's the dilemma. Yes, we have free will, but we're not really free. We have likes, we have dislikes, we have habits, and it is remarkable how predictable people are. I actually had this very interesting experience a few years ago. I was digging through some old photographs in the basement of my house, and I came across a photograph of me way back like 40 years ago when I was in college. And I was sitting at my desk, and one of my roommates had come in and took a snapshot of me, and I was sort of looking up and holding a piece of paper. And the thing that I found most remarkable about it was that if I looked at how my desk was arranged, that all I would have to do is put in a computer monitor and a keyboard and Photoshop me in the way I look now with a beard and gray hair, and it would have looked exactly the same. My desk was arranged exactly the same now as it was 41 years ago. And I thought, how remarkable we are as creatures of habit. My stapler was within 6 inches of where I keep it now. It's just, and that was 41 years ago, more than half a lifetime ago. And yet, that just seemed perfectly fine. And how many other things in our life are just like that, that basically we have habits in how we do things. And so here we've been given this remarkable freedom of doing whatever we want, and yet we just keep doing it the same way. Or we have likes and dislikes that we keep going after or keep pushing away things, and every time it doesn't work, and yet we don't learn from it. We keep trying to do the same things over and over again in relationships, in work, in money. We tend to make the same mistakes over and over again because we have these patterns built into us, and our ego keeps telling us that, well, we really need to defend ourselves. We really need to be who we are. We have free will. We should be looking out for ourselves. One of the things that I realized, and I thought this is very interesting how God has created us, is that, yes, we're endowed with an ego. We're endowed with free will. We bring with us many lifetimes of habits and likes and dislikes. And so that controls so much of what we do. And so this idea of freedom, it really doesn't exist. We're really driven by all these inner little pushes and blinders and boundaries that keep us funneled in this little narrow channel of behavior. One of the things that really struck me about this is that as long as we are willing to work at that level and only want to work at that level, our ego keeps us reincarnating, keeps us moving, keeps us reproducing, keeps us living. But at some point, when we realize that this is not who we are, this little ego, that there's something vastly greater than us, much larger than us, that is really our true existence, that yes, in fact, this is God's body, and we live in God's consciousness. And not only that, we can be one with that. We can make that our reality. We cannot just become Christ-like. We can become a Christ. We can become a Krishna. And in fact, that's our true legacy, not the car keys thrown to us so we can see how much fun we can have and how much trouble we can get into in any given lifetime. But in the end game is really for us to become Christ, to become Krishna. You know, the thing that struck me about this was that once we begin to wake up, once begin to realize that this is really what we're after, the confinement of our ego, the confinement of our likes and dislikes become like an uncomfortable straitjacket. And the pain of acting in accordance with our ego, but not in accordance with our higher self, with our Christ consciousness, with our Christ awareness, becomes painful. It becomes painful in our heart. And we know when we've done things wrong because our heart is hurt. And our hearts remain restless until we're one with God again. The good news is that when we're at this point here, when we're sitting in a situation like this, wanting to become closer to God, it means we're very close to the end. You know, it's a little bit of a horrifying thought to think that it's literally millions of lifetimes for us, millions and millions of lifetimes to find God. But we're right at the end when we realize that that's what we want, that we've already done all the awful work of getting to the point that we really don't want the ego anymore. We don't want the constriction and restriction of the ego anymore, that we really want, as the prodigal son, to come home and to be awake again and be one again with the Father, one again with Divine Mother, and to feel every atom of our being vibrating with Christ consciousness. It's there, that aurora of energy and consciousness that is God, that suffuses us. We can be one with that. It's there, but we have to feel it. We have to be subtle. And we have to let the ego relax. You know, this is one of the remarkable things about how we are designed spiritually, is that as we pursue God, as that we become lovers of God and make more and more that's our focus, our hearts are opening, we're awakening to God, that becomes our reality. And the ego automatically begins to relax. And it has less of a hold on us. In fact, the farther we go down the path, even if we get confronted with things that are tremendous desires for us, or we get confronted with things that we really dislike and yet we must do them, that we find that it's easier just to push through those things and stay on the path of seeking God because our ego has less of a hold on us. So that's one great blessing in all this, is that it actually gets easier the farther along we get, because our reality begins to feel more like this superconscious sensation, superconscious awareness that we're God already. Every atom, every particle of our being is already God's awareness and God's consciousness, and we're becoming that, and our ego is beginning to relax. You know, I think very simple things to remember as we live our lives, as we go through all the tests we have to go through. And you can be sure everything that comes to us, every experience you have is designed for us. It's our karma coming to us, and it's there as a lesson. And we're so close to the end with this, that everything is coming to us with a very particular reason, with a very particular lesson. And what we need to remember is there's several clues of knowing of, are we working with the ego and just gratifying the ego, or are we working with God's consciousness, with becoming in tune with Christ consciousness, becoming more Christ-like, more Krishna-like, fulfilling our destiny to become a Christ? And there's several things that I think are simple ways of doing that. First, what does this thing I'm going to do, does it reinforce my ego and make me feel more constrained, or does it make me feel expansive? When I feel in my heart and I ask God about what I'm going to do, does it make my heart feel contracted and painful, or does it make me feel expansive and more Christ-like? Also, I think it's helpful to remember, Swami said this very recently, and it's one of those things that is such a core concept to being successful on the spiritual path. This was actually at our 4th of July celebration. He actually said this sort of quietly in the middle of his talk. He said, the spiritual path is really pretty easy. Don't want what you want. And really what he was saying is, don't want what your ego wants, and then you can be free in super consciousness. Then you can be free in Christ consciousness. It's funny, it feels like the winds of change are here. I think I'd just like to close with saying that, remember, God loves us, and He has waited for eternity for us to return to Him. Every atom of our being, every thought we have behind it is God's love and joy. And He's waiting purely for us to recognize that fact and to be awake in that. Whatever you're going through, whatever pain is in your life, whatever has happened to you at any time in your lifetime that causes you pain and makes you feel small and makes you feel inadequate, remember that is not your reality. It would be, I think, horrifying for all of us if we could look back even 5 or 10 lifetimes and just see all the mistakes we've made and the horrible things we've done. I think it would be just absolutely shocking. It's sort of a relief that every 80 or so years we get rebooted, we get reset, and we get to start over again without a tremendous memory of how we've blown it in the past. Because no one gets there without making a lot of mistakes. But remember, we are so close to the end now, and God only wants our happiness and joy. And remember, underlying every thought, underlying even the creation of our physical body, is God's consciousness. And it's up to us to be subtle, to relax into feeling God's awareness and God's consciousness, and letting that be our reality. Let the ego relax. One last thing to mention, even if you look at how our brains are designed, there's a portion of our brain that is very primitive, that's called the limbic system. It's the portion of our brain that's concerned with instinctual function and primitive emotions, things like rage and panic when someone is having an anxiety attack or they're depressed. This is the portion of their brain that is activated when someone's defending their territory or trying to build themselves up. This is the portion of their brain that's active. You can find a limbic system in even very simple animals. A rabbit or a crocodile has a limbic system. But we actually have a very superconscious portion of our brain. It's called the prefrontal lobes. It's right behind our forehead. This is precisely where we meditate. When we're doing our meditation techniques, it's the part of the brain that gets activated when we meditate deeply. As Yogananda said, this is the most superconscious part of our brain. And in fact, what happens when the prefrontal lobes get activated, they inhibit the function of the more primitive portion of our brain, the limbic system. And again, it mimics this whole play of when we're willing to let go of the ego, it gets quieted down and the superconscious aspect of our being takes over. Our brain as a correlate, a physical correlate, when we're ready to be superconscious beings, our prefrontal lobes awaken. In fact, we kick open this doorway to superconsciousness. That's the way the yogis describe it, is there's this window to infinity, And when we meditate deeply and our prefrontal lobes become activated, we kick open this window to this superconscious world, which is our birthright. And automatically the limbic system is quieted, it's inhibited. It's a neurological phenomenon that we know well about now. So even at the level of our physical being, God has built in this process that during God realization, that our lesser self is willing to let go. Our lesser self is willing to be quiet and let us be Christ's. All we have to do is realize that and relax into our future, relax into our reality, and let the ego go. Let our likes and dislikes go. Let our habits go, and realize that our true freedom is in God. For all of us, God is a loving God. God has been waiting for millennia, for eternity, for us to come home. And we're right at the end now. And it's time for all of us to accept his invitation as loving children and say, you have been with me all eternity, and it's time for me to come home. Please bring me home quickly.